First, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your expertise, please?
Sure. Well, my name is Angela Rickford. I actually was born and raised in Guyana in South America.
Oh, wow.
And so I spent the first 18 years of my life there and left home to go to college at the age of 18.
Wow.
And I did my first degree, my bachelor's degree, at the University of the West Indies and in Jamaica at Mona.
Oh, from Jamaica.
I did my first degree there. I'm not from there, I'm from Guyana.
Oh, I see.
And I did my first degree there. That was a Bachelor of Arts. It was an honors degree in English literature. And then I did a master's degree, Master's of Science in Education, with a focus on teaching English as a second language at the University of Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was my first visit to this country. I first came to this country
For grad school.
Yeah, for grad school. And then I did my doctorate at Stanford University. I did my PhD at Stanford in education with a focus on literacy development.
Literacy development.
Language literacy and culture was my subfield at Stanford. And I finished my doctorate in 1996. And I started teaching at San Jose State in 1996.
Oh, since 1996.
Yeah,
My
so I've been
goodness.
here 22 years.
So I understand this is your expertise is in dyslexia, reading comprehension. Can you tell us what is dyslexia?
Well, my expertise is in literacy in general and reading comprehension. Actually, you wrote a book on teaching reading comprehension. Dyslexia is the inability to read, really. Children or adults, anyone who struggles with reading might be diagnosed as dyslexic. It really comes from two terms. The Greek lexis means speech, and dys, dys, is a negativizing prefix. It means difficulty, or literally in Greek it means bad. Not able to read. So anybody who is unable to read for whatever reason tends to be assessed as dyslexic. It's a very broad term, and people who are unable to read or who struggle with learning to read can exist on a continuum from very little difficulty to extreme difficulty. But we tend to use just the one umbrella term, dyslexia, to describe students who are unable to read.
Is this something that we are born with this problem? Or?
Excellent question. Dyslexia is heritable. It's genetic based, genetically based. So it tends to run in families. One would find if a student is diagnosed as dyslexic, there's a very good chance that there's another family member, a close family member, who has also struggled with reading. Some people manage to get through it without ever having been diagnosed. Others need significant intervention to be able to function in the world. But yes, it's strongly genetic, and it's usually there's a parent or grandparent or family member, uncle, aunt, somebody who has it. And often, in my experience, when I talk about this condition in my course, I would often have a student come up afterwards and say, I think I have dyslexia.
Oh my goodness.
Or, I think my daughter might have dyslexia. I'm going to have her tested. I always recommend that they have the child assessed, because if we know what the condition is, then we can help. There are strategies and techniques to help those children learn to read. If we don't know, then they tend to be they tend to get discouraged and they tend to become very, they lose confidence in themselves in the academic enterprise, and they tend to not do well in school. So early diagnosis is very beneficial.
Then what are some of the symptoms, or is there some part of our brain or something that's wrong, or how?
Oh, those are, you're asking excellent questions.
Okay.
Well, some of the symptoms are hesitation with respect to reading. For example, I'll give you an actual example. Last year, I taught a course, a practicum course, which requires faculty to go visit prospective teachers who are doing our credential in their classroom. And I was visiting one teacher, and there was a child sitting in the front row, and during the language arts session when there was reading, she just kept looking up, looking to her neighbor, looking behind, looking in front, just not focusing on the book, and everybody else was paying attention as the reading progressed. And so
kids, right?
yeah, but I could tell from the way she was avoiding the exercise of reading that it was deeper than just being a child who was fidgety. And so I said to the teacher afterwards, I think the third child in the second row from the left might have a reading problem. And she said, how do you know? I think she's dyslexic. I think she might have dyslexia. We tend not to attribute the condition as a descriptor to the child. So instead of saying she's a dyslexic child, we say she's a child with dyslexia.
Thank you.
Because first she's a child or a person or an adult, and the dyslexia is just a condition she happens to have.
Right.
And so those are some of the symptoms, just avoidance behavior. Okay. And if it gets really difficult for the child, they often begin to act out, and so they become the class clown, or the boys tend to act out more frequently than girls. But in terms of the literacy-based symptoms, they just struggle with print. They struggle with the alphabetic principle, which is the understanding or the insight that there's a one-to-one correspondence between the sounds of our speech and their written representation in print, the graphemes that represent the speech sounds that we make. Most of us who are good readers know that. Most children who have dyslexia don't, and they struggle with that understanding. Years and years and years ago, we used to think that it was based on sight. They weren't seeing well. We would give them colored glasses, or we would give them colored rulers to place under the letters. But over the last couple of decades, we found out a lot more about the condition than we ever have before. And we now know that children who have dyslexia essentially have a condition that is brain-based. They can't help it. It's not that they're not trying hard. Okay. In fact, these children often tend to try very hard, but it's the way their brains are wired.
So is that sort of the left or right hemisphere?
Well, that's a simplified analysis of it. It really has to do with three areas of the brain. With reading requires. Would you like to see this?
Yes.
Reading requires phonological processing, understanding what sounds are represented by the letters.
This is the front?
Yeah, this is a picture of the front of the brain. Okay. This is the inferior frontal gyrus. Okay. This is the superior temporal gyrus, and this is the extrastriate cortex.
I see.
This is the area responsible for word meaning, and this is the area responsible for letter identification. In the normal reader, in the average reader, all three of these areas work in tandem. They work together to help us understand words and make meaning of the print. In children with dyslexia, there's a very lot of difficulty in the first step in the area of phonological processing, just in the ability to hear and distinguish sound. So that is so fundamental to reading that if they can't get past this, yes.
So they couldn't say it out loud.
Yeah, then they can't read. What is really interesting, however, is that in many cases, those very children who lack phonological processing can actually comprehend. They're actually able to understand if you were to read to them.
Oh, so they can understand but not able to say it out loud.
They can understand, but they're not able to read themselves.
I see. Okay.
So that's actually encouraging.
Okay.
Because we now have strategies and techniques that we know can help them overcome the struggles and challenges with respect to
I
phonological
also heard
processing.
there's some, they kind of reverse the words.
That's
Is that
the reason I didn't say that was one of the symptoms is that it sometimes is and sometimes isn't. The average toddler who is learning to write tends to reverse letters at some point. That does not necessarily mean that he or she will become a dyslexic person with dyslexia. But that can be one of the symptoms of a child with dyslexia. But it's not always the primary one, and it's not always a distinctive feature of the condition.
Oh, so then can I say that maybe in terms of college students, or yes, you progressing, develop later, then it's more of you can understand, you need someone to read it to you?
Yeah, there are still students who are in college who students who have dyslexia who can only read if they read out loud.
I see.
Or if they read using their finger. They tend to need multisensory input. A lot of children with dyslexia tend to do better when they use the other senses. It's almost as if I've often heard it said that when a person is born blind, that child would develop more acute senses in the other areas, hearing and touch and so on. It's sort of similar with children with dyslexia. And so we know that if we incorporate multisensory elements into their learning, they do better.
So in a sense, actually the screen reader will help a dyslexia student.
The what? Sorry?
Screen reader.
Yes. So we know that we must incorporate the visual input, the auditory input, the kinesthetic input, the tactile input. I often, when I'm teaching, I refer to it as the V.A.K.T syndrome, the ability, I encourage my teachers to incorporate into every lesson for their children with dyslexia a visual input. They need to see an auditory input. They need to hear a kinesthetic input. They need to move and they need to touch, tactile. Often V.A.K.T. Yeah, often they use. I've seen teachers use shaving cream to help children trace letters, or what's that stuff that you put on donuts, the sweet stuff, the white stuff, not sour cream, the frosting.
The whipped cream.
The whipped cream.
Okay.
They use that.
I see.
And sometimes they use sand for the tactile input for them to trace letters. There are also lots of other techniques.